The first time anyone noticed the man walking down the dirt road with the thin rope in his hand, they laughed before they even understood what they were looking at. The rope was faded, the boots on his feet were worn on the edges, and the horse trailing behind him looked like it had seen too many winters. Its ribs showed through its coat, its steps were slow, and every few yards it paused as if gathering strength. Folks leaning against the fence post chuckled under their breath, whispering about how the poor man had nothing except that tired animal. Some joked that even the horse looked embarrassed to be seen beside him. But the man kept walking with his hand resting gently on the rope, his body steady, his face calm. The laughter behind him never made him turn around. No one knew much about him back then. He lived in a small cabin at the far end of the fields where the grass grew uneven and the soil was rough. People said the cabin was barely standing, held together more by stubbornness than wood. Others said he preferred life that way, far from the noise of the town. The only thing he brought with him whenever he came to the market was the horse. Some said he should sell it and use the money to fix his life. Others said a man like him had no business keeping an animal he could barely feed. He heard those comments often, though no one said them to his face. The words would float through the air behind him, carried by voices that thought they were safe because he chose silence. The horse had its own story, though no one asked about it. It had once been strong, the kind of animal that made people stop and admire its stance. But hardship changes a creature, and this one had seen enough hardship to leave marks all over its body. The man knew every one of those marks. He knew the rough patches on its coat, the scars on its legs, the way it flinched at sudden sounds. He had found it injured near the river one morning, long before any of the folks in town even cared to look that way. While most saw a broken animal, he saw something worth saving. He spent months caring for it quietly, bringing it water before sunrise, gathering feed even when he barely had enough for himself, brushing its coat until the dust no longer clung to it. He talked to it gently, the way someone does when they expect nothing in return. The horse learned to trust him slowly. It no longer trembled at every movement. It lifted its head when he approached. It followed his voice the way lost souls follow warmth. Still, to the rest of the world, it was a worthless creature walking beside a man who owned nothing. The town was full of people who valued what they could see: fresh coats of paint, neat clothes, polished boots. They believed success was something you could measure by fences and barns. The man did not have any of those things. He never tried to impress anyone either. That bothered some people more than they admitted. They could not understand how someone could walk through town with his back straight even when he had nothing to his name. Some thought he must be foolish. Others thought he must be hiding something. Whatever they believed, their laughter always found him, carried by their own need to feel bigger than his quiet way of living. There was one day in particular that stayed in everyone's memory. The sun was sharp, the dust rising in clouds beneath the hooves of other riders. The man led his horse toward the water trough near the market. A group of younger men stood nearby, leaning against the fence rails with smug grins that never seemed to leave their faces. They laughed louder than usual that day. One of them made a loud comment about how the horse looked like it belonged in a scrap heap more than in a pasture. Another said maybe the man kept it because it was the only thing that couldn't walk away from him. Their voices carried across the open space like sharp stones thrown carelessly. The man paused for a moment. Not long enough to show anger, not long enough to show hurt. He simply rested his hand on the horse's neck, whispering something only the animal heard. Then he continued walking. The laughter felt heavier behind him this time, but he never reacted. The horse dipped its head into the water, the cool surface rippling slowly. The crowd watched him with mocking curiosity, waiting for him to break. But he didn't, he never did. Some people wondered why he tolerated so much disrespect without speaking up. Others said he must have grown used to it, as if being poor and quiet meant a person carried no pride. The truth, however, sat quietly inside him. He knew hardship better than all of them combined. He understood the value of patience, the weight of time, and the strength that comes from holding on to something when everyone else turns away. He had learned long ago that a person who keeps going in silence is far stronger than a crowd shouting with full lungs. The horse grew stronger with each passing season. It no longer limped, its coat gained a richer color. Its spirit returned slowly, like a forgotten fire warming back to life. People noticed the change but refused to give credit to the man. They said even a weak animal improves on its own if time allows. They dismissed the hours he spent caring for it, the nights he stayed awake when the horse struggled to stand, the sacrifices he made. Their pride would not let them see the truth. Sometimes people fear acknowledging goodness in others, especially when it highlights their own flaws. Yet the man did not seek admiration. He did not care who noticed. He cared only for the bond he shared with the animal beside him. In a world full of loud judgments, that bond was the only steady thing he had. He understood the quiet loyalty of the horse in a way others never would. It trusted him without question, and he trusted it in return. Time flowed in its own slow way, shaping lives without announcing its purpose. The town changed bit by bit, though its people stayed much the same. Harvests rose and fell. Families grew and drifted. The man kept walking the same path from his cabin to the market with his horse beside him. Every season brought new whispers, new laughter, new reasons for the townsfolk to underestimate him, but he remained steady. There was something in his eyes that held a promise no one recognized. Years passed, each one carrying small shifts that no one paid attention to until it was too late to ignore. The land around the man's cabin started looking different. The soil, once rough and dry, began to grow greener. Someone noticed a new fence going up near the edge of the property. Someone else mentioned seeing him working late in the fields. Rumors spread slowly at first, like sparks drifting before a fire catches. But no one knew the truth yet. No one knew how much was about to change, or how deeply their laughter would return to them in the form of quiet regret. The town had laughed at the poor man for loving his horse. They never expected that the very fields they looked down on would one day belong to him. They never imagined that the same man they mocked would hold the kind of power that didn't need loud words or flashy displays. They never realized that patience can turn into strength and that strength can reshape everything around it. And on the day the truth finally came to light, the townsfolk gathered near the fences in stunned silence as they saw something they never believed possible. The man who once walked alone now owned the very farm they stood on, and nothing in their world felt the same anymore. The news that the man now owned the farm spread through the town like a gust of wind pushing open every door. People who once looked past him now found themselves whispering his name in surprise. Children who grew up watching him walk with his horse pulled at their parents' sleeves, asking how something like that could happen. The older folks narrowed their eyes, searching their memories for signs they might have missed, clues that hinted at the change growing quietly on his land. The truth was that no one had ever taken the time to look closely. The man had always moved like someone who knew where he was going, even when the rest of the world believed he had nothing. And now, as the dust settled around the rumor that had become fact, the town realized they knew very little about him at all. The cabin he lived in had always been a place people avoided. Not because it held anything dangerous, but because it looked so plain and forgotten that no one imagined anything important could come from it. The roof sagged on one side. The porch steps creaked loud enough to warn anyone approaching. The fences were patched with mismatched boards. But the land around it told a different story. While others saw rough ground, the man saw something worth tending. He had spent countless evenings working the soil, turning it with steady patience, learning its moods and limits. He planted small crops at first, testing what would grow. Many of those early attempts failed, but he studied the failures carefully. Those who knew him from afar thought he was wasting his time. They watched him haul buckets of water by hand, watched him mend fences with scraps, watched him push through seasons that shifted between drought and mud. No one understood why he kept going. The horse was always there beside him. Even when the farm looked hopeless, the horse followed him through the fields, its ears flicking at every small change in the land. People said a weak animal like that had no place in hard work, but the man never asked it to do more than it could. He tended the fields himself, giving the horse light tasks to help rebuild its strength. The bond between them grew even stronger with every long day. Some evenings he sat on the porch with a tin cup in his hand, watching the sun drop behind the hills, the horse grazing quietly near the fence line. Those moments gave him more peace than anything money could buy. What no one knew was how the man had learned to read land the way others read letters. He came from a place far away, shaped by long summers and rough winters that forced people to understand the ground beneath their feet. From a young age, he learned how soil responds to care, how water moves underground, how to see the future of a field simply by touching it. Those lessons stayed with him even when life took everything else away. By the time he arrived in the small town with nothing but the clothes on his back and the horse he rescued, he carried knowledge that most people never realized they lacked. He did not share stories about his past, not because he hid anything, but because he felt no need to explain himself. He believed the world revealed itself through actions, not words. And so he worked, day after day, slowly shaping the land that others thought useless. Each season rewarded him a little more, first with patches of grass that grew thicker, then with small crops that lasted through the winter. When the townspeople passed by on their wagons, they would sometimes slow down without admitting it, staring at the once barren fields now showing signs of quiet life. Still, no one talked about it out loud. They preferred jokes and whispers over confronting the reality that the man they mocked might be building something greater than they ever imagined. There were rumors that he had started buying land quietly, piece by piece, from families who were moving away or struggling with their own farms. Some people said it was strange that someone as poor as he seemed could afford to do that. Others insisted he must have found a way to earn money without anyone noticing, but no one bothered asking him how he did it. They chose their own stories instead of seeking the truth. The real answer was simple and came from long hours spent walking from town to town doing whatever work he could find. Fence repair, hauling wood, clearing fields, tending livestock for families who didn't have the strength anymore. He worked quietly and saved everything he earned. The horse stayed with him through all of it, waiting patiently in the shade when he worked and walking beside him on long trips back home. As the years passed, the town grew comfortable with their assumptions about him. They convinced themselves that he was harmless, someone who existed on the edges of their world without ever stepping into it. No one saw the slow change happening right under their feet. The man who had once walked through town with the weight of laughter behind him was building something steady, brick by brick, root by root. One spring morning, when the frost had just started lifting from the ground, a group of men rode out near the property line of the large farm that had been in the same family for generations. They were checking the fences after a storm when they noticed something odd. Fresh posts stood in place where the old ones had rotted. The wires seemed new. They followed the line farther and saw more changes. At first they assumed someone from the big farm had done the repairs, but the style of the work was different. It was the same careful, precise way the man repaired his own fences. When they reached the far side of the field, they found a marker in the soil that confirmed the unbelievable truth. The land now belonged to him. When word reached the owner of the big farm, a wave of disbelief spread through the family. For decades they had held the fields without challenge. Everyone knew their name. Their wealth and influence shaped nearly every decision in town. To think that the man they mocked had somehow bought a portion of their land felt like a joke, but the papers were real. The sale had been agreed to months before, signed quietly by a distant relative who wanted to leave the town and start over elsewhere. The family never expected someone like the quiet man to be the buyer. The discovery stirred a quiet tension that spread through every corner of the community. Some people felt uneasy, suddenly aware that they had no idea how much land the man owned now. Others felt guilty, remembering the years they spent mocking him for loving his horse more than his pride. A few felt threatened, as if his success somehow challenged the balance of the town. Whispers grew heavier. Conversations changed tones when his name came up. People who once ignored him now watched his cabin as if the walls might reveal secrets. Through all of this, the man continued living the same way he always had. He woke before sunrise, tended the fields, spoke softly to the horse, repaired fences, and walked into town only when necessary. He never boasted. He never confronted anyone about their past behavior. He treated every person with the same quiet respect he always had. But beneath the calm surface, something important was shifting. The town could feel it even if they didn't understand it. The horse sensed it too. It had grown strong, its coat shining, its steps confident. When the man led it through town now, people watched with hesitant eyes instead of mockery. Children stepped back respectfully. Adults nodded while pretending not to, but the man remained unchanged. His loyalty to the horse had never been about proving a point. It was about honoring the bond that had held them together through every rough year. What no one realized was that he still had decisions to make. The land he now owned carried a history that would not sit quietly. The families who once controlled it were not ready to let go. The fields held memories, grudges, old deals made under the table. And as the town whispered about the rising power of the once poor man, something unseen hovered over the horizon, waiting to challenge the calm he had built. The season was turning. The fields were growing. The horse walked with steady strength, but the peace around the farm was tightening like a rope just before it snaps. And the man knew that the time was coming when he would have to face not only the land he gained, but the people who believed it should never have belonged to him in the first place. The tension around the farm grew slowly at first, like a faint sound people tried to ignore. But day by day it pressed heavier on the town, until even those who rarely paid attention to anything outside their own fences began to feel something shifting. The man's rise from poverty to ownership rattled people in ways they didn't admit out loud. Some feared he would change the town's balance. Some feared they had underestimated him for too long. And some feared what it said about them that they had mocked someone who carried more strength and patience than any of them combined. One of the loudest voices stirring the tension came from the family who had lost part of their land. The head of that family had always taken pride in controlling the fields that stretched across the valley. He walked with the confidence of someone who believed his position was permanent. Losing even a small corner of his property felt like a personal insult. Worse yet, the buyer was the same man he once called worthless. He couldn't accept it. He told his sons that something wasn't right, that a man with nothing couldn't earn enough to buy what he had worked generations to build. The sons repeated those words wherever they went, and each time the story twisted a little more, planting seeds of doubt across the town. Some people started saying the man must have struck some hidden deal. Others said he probably stole something or tricked the seller. None of these claims held truth, but truth mattered less than pride. And wounded pride often grew into something sharp, something dangerous. The family began studying the farm from a distance, riding past slowly, watching the changes on the land with narrowed eyes. The man noticed, but said nothing. He kept working, letting actions remain his only defense. One quiet afternoon, as he was repairing a gate near the edge of the property, the sons approached him on horseback. They stopped at the fence and stared down at him with the kind of confidence people use when they believe someone is beneath them. They said they wanted to ask how he came into so much land. They said it with smiles that never reached their eyes. Their tone was polite, but their words carried challenge. The man wiped his hands on his trousers, stood upright, and told them the truth without adding anything extra. He said he saved his earnings, bought the land fair and honest, but his answer didn't satisfy them. They rode off muttering to one another, leaning close as if exchanging warnings. After that, the visits became more frequent. Sometimes the sons rode past at dusk. Sometimes they lingered near the property line as if expecting the man to slip up and reveal something. The horse stayed alert whenever they came. It stood beside the man with its ears pointed sharply, its steps measured. The man would rest a hand on its neck to calm it, though he knew the animal sensed something deeper than loud voices or proud riders. Horses notice what people pretend not to see. Meanwhile, the townspeople carried their own mix of guilt and curiosity. Some avoided the man altogether, fearing he might remind them of how they treated him for years. Others tried to act friendly in hopes of earning back his trust, though most of their smiles were thin and unsure. Shopkeepers offered him lower prices. Neighbors nodded more often when he passed. But the man didn't change his ways. He spoke when spoken to, helped when asked, and walked through town with the same steady steps he always had. The horse followed him with quiet dignity, its coat shining in the sun like proof of years of care. There was one person, however, who watched the man with a different kind of interest. A young worker at the mill had noticed how hard he labored season after season, and how the horse remained by his side through every hardship. She admired resilience more than wealth, and she saw something honest in the man that others overlooked. Whenever she visited the market, she found herself looking for him, curious about the path he walked to get where he was. She didn't speak to him often, but she watched with thoughtful eyes, noticing the strain that shadows his steps whenever the sons rode near his land. She told her father that the town was treating him unfairly, but he warned her to keep her thoughts quiet. People didn't like being reminded of their mistakes. As tensions grew, the land itself became part of the conflict. Strange things began happening along the edges of the man's property. One morning he found a section of fence cut clean through, the wire left dangling like someone had done it in the dark. Another day he noticed wagon tracks leading deep into one of his fields where no wagon had any reason to be. A few nights he heard distant voices drifting along the ridge, low and heated. The horse stayed restless on those nights, pacing the small pasture until the man stepped outside with a lantern. He repaired what he could without complaint. He tightened the fences, cleaned the tracks, and kept working as usual. But inside he knew someone was trying to provoke him. He just didn't know if it was driven by revenge, jealousy, or simple refusal to accept change. And the town kept watching from the shadows, pretending not to see what was happening. One evening, the sky darkened with heavy clouds as the man walked the fields with the horse at his side. The air held a thick tension that made even the insects quiet. He reached the far edge of his land where a row of old oak trees grew along a slope. Those trees had stood longer than every farm around them, their thick trunks bearing scars from storms long past. At the base of one tree he saw a fresh mark carved into the bark. It wasn't a name or a sign he knew. It was a crude symbol, the kind used when someone wanted to leave a message without speaking aloud. The horse shoved its nose against his arm, uneasy. The man studied the mark and felt something shift inside him. Someone was trying to discourage him, trying to push him back into the shadows he once lived in, but he had come too far for that. He placed his hand on the tree, taking a slow breath, and turned back toward the cabin with the horse walking close behind him. The conflict deepened when the big farm announced that they were hosting a gathering for landowners. It was something they had done for years, a way of reminding the town who held the most influence. But this time people whispered that the gathering was meant for something else. Some said the family wanted to challenge the man publicly, to pressure him into giving up what he had earned. Others said they planned to humiliate him the way they once did, only now with the whole town watching. The man received an invitation written in formal ink, its tone stiff and unfriendly. He read it at his kitchen table while the horse stood outside the window, grazing peacefully. He knew the invitation wasn't a gesture of respect. It was a challenge. Days before the gathering, the atmosphere in town tightened further. People watched the roads nervously. Conversations cut off when the man passed. Even the fields seemed unsettled, the wind blowing in sharp bursts instead of steady streams. The man continued working, but he could feel the weight of what was coming. The conflict wasn't just about land anymore. It was about pride, history, and the quiet strength that had threatened those who believed their power was permanent. The horse remained his calm in the storm. When he laid a hand on its muzzle, the world steadied. That animal had stood with him through the hard years when no one else believed in him. And now, when the whispers turned into something darker, the horse followed him with unwavering loyalty. As the day of the gathering approached, the man prepared without showing fear. He cleaned his boots, brushed the horse, and walked the fields one more time, checking every fence, every post, every corner of the land that carried his effort. But somewhere beyond the hills, trouble was already moving. And the man sensed that whatever happened at that gathering would change more than just the ownership of land. It would reveal who in the town still held on to old bitterness, and who might finally confront the truth they had been avoiding for years. He woke before the sun again, the kind of waking that came from habit rather than rest. The night had been long and uneasy, filled with the same mix of hope and fear that had followed him since the day the deal was offered. He moved quietly so he wouldn't wake anyone in the house, though there was no one now except the silence and the memories left behind. He stepped out into the yard, pulling his coat tight as a cold breeze moved across the open land. The sky was still a deep shade of blue, but a thin line of light showed on the horizon. His horse lifted its head from the stall, ears forward as if it knew something important was coming. He walked over and placed a hand on its warm neck, letting his breathing settle. The bond they shared had carried him through many rough years, and today felt like the edge of something even bigger. The land stretched far in every direction. Much of it wasn't his yet, not officially, but he had worked every inch of it until it felt like it belonged to him in spirit. The farm owner had told him he could take full charge of the place if he proved he could keep it running through the season. It was a test meant to break him, or at least expose any weakness he had left. Most men in town thought he would fail before the first month ended. They had laughed when the owner gave him the chance, saying he wasn't strong enough or smart enough to manage so much on his own. They said a man who cared more about his horse than his pride couldn't understand real work. But he pushed those voices aside. He kept showing up every morning, and each evening his horse stayed by him as if sharing the weight of every task. There was still plenty of trouble brewing around him. The men who mocked him earlier now watched him with a mix of irritation and suspicion. They didn't like how steady he was becoming. They didn't like how he refused to quit. They didn't like that the owner trusted him more than them. Some of those men had wanted the chance he got, and the bitterness grew louder each week. They whispered that he had gotten lucky, that nobody could turn a broken-down farm into something worth saving. They didn't know how many nights he spent planning each repair or how often he forced himself to keep going even when his hands bled. They didn't see how the simple bond between man and horse became the only comfort that kept him grounded. He walked through the fields now, checking the fences, feeling the soil with his boots, counting the small changes he had made. The barn repairs were holding. The water lines he installed were working fine. The crop rows were finally showing signs of life. Even the animals seemed calmer, as though they sensed order returning to the land. But he knew order didn't last long in places like this. Trouble had a way of crawling back whenever things started to look better. Later that morning, he carried feed to the far side of the farm where the cattle grazed. His horse followed him without needing to be told, keeping a close but respectful distance. That loyal presence meant everything to him. He remembered when he first found the horse, thin and unwanted, tied near an old shed. People said it was useless. Some even joked that the horse was just as hopeless as the man trying to save it. But he saw something different. He saw a creature that still had fight left in it. He spent months nursing it back to strength, and as the horse grew healthier, so did the man's spirit. They rose together through every hardship. When he reached the fence line, he noticed hoof tracks that didn't belong to his herd. They were too fresh and too deep. Someone had been on his land again. This wasn't the first time he saw signs of unwanted visitors. Tools went missing. Gates were left open. Once, someone even tried to scare the cattle off so he'd lose days trying to round them up. These weren't accidents, they were warnings. The men who didn't want him on this farm were getting desperate. He crouched near the tracks, studying them, and his horse lowered its head as if sensing his concern. He placed a hand on its muzzle, grounding himself. Whoever was creeping around the property wanted to rattle him before the season ended. If they could prove he wasn't capable of keeping things under control, the owner might reconsider the deal. That was the goal. They wanted him shaken. But fear and frustration only made him more determined. This farm was the first real chance he ever had, and he wasn't going to let it slip away. The day carried on with more tension than usual. Every sound felt sharper, every shadow seemed to move. He stayed alert, scanning the trees and listening for anything out of place. He had lived long enough with judgment from others, but the quiet hostility building around him was different. This wasn't just about pride anymore. This was about ownership, power, and control of the land. And the men working against him believed he was in their way. As afternoon light softened into gold, he took his horse toward the creek. This was the place where he often cleared his head after a long day. The water moved steady, reflecting the sky, the trees, and the edges of the farm he was fighting for. He sat on a fallen log and let the horse graze nearby. His mind raced with thoughts about the strangers on his land, the work left to finish, and the expectations he still had to meet. The owner would return soon to check on the progress. And when he did, everything had to be perfect. While he rested, he heard a distant rumble. It wasn't thunder, it was two rhythmic hooves, more than one horse. He stood slowly, squinting through the trees. 3 riders emerged from the far side, moving along the fence line. They weren't ranch hands. He recognized their faces even from a distance. These were the same men who used to laugh at him outside the supply store. The same men who called him foolish. The same men who believed he had no right to be here. They slowed their horses and stared across the field, not crossing the boundary but making their intention clear. They wanted to be seen. They wanted him to know they were watching. His heartbeat tightened. His horse stepped closer to him, ears pinned in warning. The men didn't speak or gesture. They simply sat there for a long moment before turning away and riding off. It wasn't a friendly visit, it was a signal. Something was building. Something bigger than the petty trouble he had dealt with so far. And he had no idea how much time he had before it happened. That evening he returned to the barn and secured everything he could. He made sure the gates were locked, the animals sheltered, and every tool stored out of reach. The sun dipped below the hills, pulling a heavy shadow over the land. He leaned on the stall door and watched his horse settle into the hay. Despite the fear rising in his chest, the sight of that quiet loyalty steadied him again. If he could face the world with this horse beside him, maybe he could push through whatever waited on the other side of the night. Still, as he lay in bed later, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was closing in. The silence inside the house felt thicker than usual. The wind outside carried a strange, tense edge. The men who rode along his fence weren't done. They were planning something, and he would have to be ready before they returned. But he didn't know what they wanted or how far they were willing to go to stop him from owning the farm. He closed his eyes, trying to rest, but his mind wouldn't settle. He kept thinking about the deal, the land, the long journey that brought him here, and the years of judgment he endured from the same people who now threatened him. Everything felt like it was racing toward a point he couldn't yet see. And somewhere in that uncertainty, a single question kept echoing through his thoughts, growing louder with every passing hour. Why were they suddenly so desperate to keep him from succeeding? He stood in the yard for a long moment, breathing hard, the cold night air brushing against his face as the final echoes of the confrontation faded into the distance. His horse was still beside him, muscles tense, eyes sharp, but slowly easing now that the danger had passed. The glow of early dawn began to stretch across the farm, touching the edges of the barn, the fences, and the fields he had fought so hard to protect. Everything looked calmer than it had hours earlier, but the tension still pressed against his chest, reminding him of how close things had come to falling apart. He reached out and rested a hand on his horse's neck. The steady warmth helped him settle, grounding him after the night's chaos. The men who tried to scare him off had finally backed down when they realized he wasn't running. They saw that he was willing to stand his ground for the land he cared for, and for the horse that had carried him through every hardship. Their plan had broken apart when they understood that he wasn't the weak man they once laughed at. Still, their retreat didn't bring relief right away. He knew their anger was rooted in years of pride and competition, and anything fueled by that kind of stubbornness didn't disappear overnight. But something had changed. The power they thought they held over him was gone. They had seen what he was willing to defend, and they finally understood that he wasn't the man they used to mock. He walked across the yard, taking in the farm with new eyes. Nothing had been damaged, but the fear of losing it lingered in the back of his mind. He checked the barn, the gates, and the animals, making sure everything was safe. The simple act of moving through familiar tasks calmed him. The rhythm of morning chores felt like a reminder that life went on, even after nights that tested everything inside him. By the time the sun rose fully, he was already working on the broken fence panel the men had loosened. He fixed it with careful hands, steady and calm. His horse stood near him, watching quietly. Later in the day, the farm owner arrived. He stepped down from his wagon with a look that was difficult to read. For a moment, the man simply observed the land, the repaired sections, the cleared pastures, the animals grazing peacefully. Then he looked at the farmer standing there, tired but unbroken. He nodded, not with surprise, but with respect that had been earned over many seasons. The owner asked him about the trouble during the night, and the farmer told him everything without trying to hide the fear or the danger. When he finished, the owner stayed silent for a moment, then said he had expected something like this might happen. There were always men who didn't want to see someone rise from nothing. But he admired how the farmer stood firm, and he said that determination was exactly what this land needed. He took a slow breath before telling him something the farmer had only dreamed of hearing. The farm was his now. The deal was complete. The words felt unreal at first. For a moment, the farmer didn't know what to say. The years of struggle, the rejection, the long days without help, the nights when he doubted he was strong enough, all collided inside him. He looked around at the land stretching out under the soft light, the fields he had restored, the barns he had rebuilt, and the horse standing steady beside him. Everything he had poured himself into was now his. He felt a tightness grow in his throat, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming relief that came when a long fight finally ends. When the owner left, the farmer leaned against the fence and let himself breathe in the quiet. His horse pressed its head against his shoulder as if sensing the shift in his spirit. For the first time, the land didn't feel like something he was borrowing. It felt like home, real home. A place that didn't depend on anyone else's approval. A place shaped by his hands, his sweat, and his belief in something bigger than his hardships. Over the next days, the men who had caused trouble didn't come near the farm again. Word spread quickly in small towns, and people began speaking differently about him. They didn't whisper doubts anymore. They didn't laugh. Some even approached him with a hint of shame on their faces, offering quiet greetings or small attempts at conversation. He didn't seek revenge, nor did he waste time holding grudges. He simply kept working, showing the same calm patience he always had. It wasn't about proving them wrong anymore. It was about living the life he had fought for. One afternoon, the same group of men who once mocked him came to the edge of the property. They didn't cross the boundary this time. They stood there, uneasy, shifting their weight like men who didn't know how to face their own mistakes. They asked if they could talk. The farmer walked toward them, steady and open, not carrying anger. They admitted they had been wrong, though they didn't say the words easily. For years they had seen him as a man beneath them, someone without a future, someone who would never rise. But seeing him stand against them changed everything. They didn't ask for forgiveness directly, but their quiet tone made it clear they carried regret. He didn't need to punish them. Life had already shown them the truth. He simply nodded and told them the past was over. Then he did something they didn't expect. He told them they no longer needed to work the owner's land because he now owned the farm. Their eyes widened, unsure what he would say next. He told them they were free to go. There was no work here for men who didn't understand the meaning of respect. He didn't say it with anger, he said it with finality. They left soon after, walking away in silence, carrying the weight of what they lost. The days that followed were peaceful. The tension that once hung over the farm lifted little by little. The land seemed to breathe easier. The farmer spent the mornings riding across the fields, checking the fences, enjoying the simple warmth of the sun on his back. His horse moved with quiet pride, as if it sensed the victory they shared. Their journey had been long, filled with moments that nearly broke them both, but they had stood through it all. As the seasons shifted, the farm flourished. The crops grew strong, the animals thrived, and the land regained the life it once lost. People in town began speaking of the farmer with admiration. They said he proved that dedication could turn any story around. They said his loyalty to his horse revealed the kind of man he truly was. He didn't care much for praise, though. What mattered was the peace he finally felt. The farm became a place where he could breathe without fear of judgment. A place where the sound of his horse's footsteps on the soil reminded him of how far he had come. A place where he learned that strength wasn't shown through loud words or pride, but through steady action and quiet courage. One evening, as the sun set across the fields, he stood by the barn with his horse beside him. The light spread over the land in soft shades, touching everything with a warm glow. He let the moment sink in. All the years of struggle, the painful memories of being laughed at, the fights he never asked for, the long nights filled with doubt, had led him here. Owning the farm wasn't just a victory. It was a reminder that resilience could outlast cruelty, and that a simple bond between a man and his horse could carry them both through any storm. He placed his hand on the horse's neck and felt the calm heartbeat beneath his palm. They had walked a hard path together, but they reached the end standing tall. The land was his, the future was open, and the peace he had searched for was finally real. As the sun dipped lower, he took a deep breath and smiled, knowing the journey had changed him in ways he would carry for the rest of his life. The poor man they once mocked had become the owner of the very farm they believed he would lose. He didn't need their respect anymore. He found something far more powerful. He found his own strength.